Brothers and sisters, we would like to continue the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Hassan Bakr. Please welcome him with a loud salawat. Ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Now, okay. ولا أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن الجبل لا رأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك نذرينها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو علم الغيب وشهادته هو الرحمن الرحيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله أما يشركون هو الله الخالق البارئ المساوي له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح ما في السماوات والأرض وهو الآن العزيز الحكيم. صدق الله العظيم.
Thank you. The next part of our program is the main talk by Akeela Ahmed. Please welcome her with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Akeela Ahmed has been an equalities activist and campaigner for nearly 20 years. On Muslim Women's Day, she was listed in Nylon magazine as an activist that is making a difference. In 2014, she founded She Speaks, We Hear, which gives unfiltered women's voice a platform. Akeela advises and works with the government in tackling anti-Muslim hatred, sitting on the anti-Muslim hatred working group as chair of the independent members. She's also a social entrepreneur with the social housing sector. She's co-organiser of the Women's March on London, in January 2017 she spoke to over 100,000 people on the Women's March on London. Her portrait is also part of the National Trust We Are Best exhibition at Hardwick Hall, which showcases modern and historic female leaders. Please welcome her again with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks so much for having me. I think that was a really nice introduction, but also slightly out of date. So my name is Akeela Ahmed, and I'm also the CEO of the British Muslim Trust. And I'm here today to talk to you about how we can better monitor anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, hate crime and hate incidents targeted against Muslims, and why that's important. And that is essentially what the British Muslim Trust has been set up to do. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Oops, no, this is the wrong, sorry. I'm just having a look now and I can see it's the wrong presentation. Okay, let me just... Sorry about that. I don't know if it's possible to set up my computer, or I might have given the wrong presentation. Yeah. Is it possible for me to email? Sorry.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Fine, so let's try again. Akeela Ahmed is the CEO of the British Muslim Trust, leading national work to support victims of anti-Muslim hatred and strengthen community resilience. Today she's been speaking about Report Islamophobia, why robust data matters. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Sorry about that. It doesn't usually happen to me, but we've been doing a few talks. Well, I've been doing a few presentations this week, so sorry, that was the wrong one. Wasn't too much difference, but I just wanted to make sure I had the right one. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about British Muslim Trust, but I'm also here to talk to you about anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia and why it's important that we monitor the data on attacks against Muslims and Islamophobic attacks and hate crimes and hate incidents, but also discrimination and prejudice. So in the photos here, you can see that we've been doing some presentations, and that was a presentation that we did in Manchester in September. So just a bit of background about the British Muslim Trust. We were founded by two Muslim philanthropic organisations, the Aziz Foundation and the Rundari Charitable Trust. You might have heard of them. They do a lot of work to try and empower and uplift Muslim communities and address social inequalities. Some of their flagship programs involve funding university students across the country. They also invest in social cohesion, interfaith, and they do a whole range of projects to try and, I guess, empower and capacity build and strengthen the resilience within Muslim communities, but also beyond, and try and build allies too. So British Muslim Trust was essentially set up by those two philanthropic organisations, and they did that because Muslim communities came to them and said that they felt that although there's been lots of different work in this area of monitoring hate crime and hate incidents targeted against Muslims, there were still huge gaps in the understanding and the data, and especially there were gaps at the policy making level. Despite us knowing that Islamophobia is increasing, we feel it in many ways for some communities in our everyday lives. The investment that government was doing to try and address Islamophobia was people felt was lacking. And then not only the investment to try and address it, but also just the money that was put aside to try and deal with the symptoms of Islamophobia was also lacking, especially if it was compared to other groups, other types of hate crime. So the two organisations came together, they set up the British Muslim Trust, and our key sort of mission and strategy is really, in an ideal world, there would be no need for an organisation like British Muslim Trust. There'd be no need to monitor Islamophobia and hate crimes separately to how we monitor other hate crimes. You know, ideally, it wouldn't take place, but obviously that could be too idealistic. But then if it does take place, we'd go to the police would deal with it, it'd be sorted out. And obviously that's not happening. So our key kind of strategy and mission is to work towards a place where actually the mainstream structures would be doing their job, and there wouldn't be a need for third-party reporting organisations like us. Unfortunately, that's not happening. So at the heart of the British Muslim Trust are the communities that we aim to serve, which is British Muslims, and then also anybody who's perceived to be Muslim, but also Muslims who are newly arrived, who come from other countries, who are not necessarily British Muslims. And the way we do that is we have a helpline, which I'll talk more about later on. Our helpline is omni-channel, and that's the kind of primary way in which people can contact us to get help if they've suffered any kind of incident, whether that's going to work, on public transport, or whilst at school. When people contact us, we'll give them victim support. That's really important, that people have a space where they feel safe, they can talk to us. But we'll not only give them victim support and give them emotional support, we'll also be there to be people's advocate. And I think that is a key component that's missing. Having somebody on your side when you've suffered any form of prejudice, discrimination, or hatred is so important. And it's a difference between feeling like you're isolated and alone and there's nobody there to help you, and then having somebody who actually is on your side, who's experienced what you've experienced and know what that's like and the impact that can have. We're also trying to make sure that people know about us, and we're doing that through community engagement, through outreach. As I mentioned earlier, we were in Manchester in September. We've also been to Bradford. We've been to other parts of the country. I don't know if some of you are aware, but there was an arson attack on a mosque in Peacehaven in October, just after the Heaton Park synagogue attack. So we were there a couple of days after that attack with the mosque. We were there to try and support them, help them. They were obviously in huge shock. It was just Allah's grace that nobody had died in that arson attack, because the imam of the mosque and somebody else were in the building and they managed to escape. And the mosque its layout, I guess, is kind of similar to this layout. So there was one main entrance and then there's one room. So if you can imagine, there isn't really much space, nowhere to go to hide if somebody's setting the mosque on fire, but he managed to escape, alhamdulillah. So we were there supporting them. We also were in Peterborough after a mosque was attacked in Peterborough, and we were also in Birmingham as well after there was a mosque that was attacked in Birmingham. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the attacks we've seen since we started our work in July against mosques. And as part of our sort of core work, we're also really keen to ensure that we have the insights, not only from the data that we get on the helpline, but also through research to understand what's the state of nation when it comes to anti-Muslim hatred. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But also then providing that robust data to government and the insights that we get from that research and analysis. And then we're hoping to take all of that and raise awareness about it and change policy to try and address some of these key issues. So this is a case study. I won't read it out, but you can have a look at it. This is something that we just dealt with. So just to say, the government basically had an open grant process for organisations to apply for funding to monitor anti-Muslim hatred. That took place in April, May of this year. And in July this year, they appointed us to be their key national partner. And so it was at that point then that we sort of hit the ground running. We started to build our infrastructure, and we've been very much in startup phase. So the helpline that I mentioned, that I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, has only been set up within the last 3 to 4 months. And before then, we didn't have the infrastructure. We've been working really hard to make sure that we've got all our systems and processes in place so that people can contact us and then get the help they need. So one of the cases we've been dealing with is, you might have heard this case, it kind of went around on WhatsApp, of a young 12-year-old boy in Birmingham who was beaten up. He was assaulted. And he was assaulted, his father says, and he says, because the fact that he was Muslim. And what they did is him and his father, they did the right thing. They contacted the police. But what happened is the police, when they came to respond to this boy, they actually cast him as the offender. And that really traumatized the boy. So can you imagine, he's 12 years old, he's suffered an attack, a physical violent attack, and then he's been told, actually, you're not the victim here, you are the perpetrator, you are the offender here. And his father was so traumatized, he didn't know what to do. And so we reached out to him and said, look, we are here to support victims of anti-Muslim hatred. You know, is there any way that we can support you? And his father was also so traumatized that initially he didn't want to speak to us. He didn't want to have any help. He was like, no, I just want to protect my son, keep my son at home. I don't want to know anybody. You know, I've been completely failed by the system. And what's to say that you won't fail us either? But we worked with him and we gave him that support that I mentioned, the kind of victim support. And then we're also working with him now to be that advocate and to be that voice to police. And this father, he's so traumatized, he's tried to complain to the police, he's tried to kind of use all the avenues he can. And he feels like he's used those avenues now and he needs support in doing that. And so that's what we're doing. And this is just one case that we're dealing with. But there are other cases from Birmingham. And actually we're seeing a trend at the moment of seeing cases from Birmingham. But we know that there are similar cases like this happening all around the country. And people are not reporting it. But what we also know is that people are feeling like when we go to places like Manchester, Bradford, in London, when we talk to people about anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, and we ask them, have you suffered anything? Are you dealing with challenges? They will all talk about feeling increasing hostility. And they'll also say that for the first time in a generation, they feel like they're experiencing the racism that their parents suffered when they came to this country. So, that's like my generation basically saying that when my parents came to this country, 60s, 70s, and they experienced, racism in the 70s and the 80s, that kind of vulgar, overt racism is now happening against my generation and below. But it's happening in such a way where it's not just about the color of our skin, the color of my skin, it's about my face, it's about the way I dress, my appearance. But what people are also telling us is that they feel like, unlike their parents, they're not new. They were born here. They've done everything right. They're integrated. They went to school here. They went to university here. They have got the job. They are, for all intents and purposes, sort of living what, any sort of good citizen should live, how they should live. But they are still being questioned. Their nationality, their loyalty, their identity is being questioned. They're being told that actually if you don't have the same skin color as a white person, then you can't be British, you can't be English. And that's not happened before. And that, in my sort of 20 plus years or whatever, working in this kind of equality space, I've not heard that before. That kind of questioning at that level. So this is unprecedented in that sense. But when we look at the numbers of hate crimes, what we're hearing is not being matched by the numbers. So I've got here some numbers of the number of hate crimes perpetrated against Muslims in the UK year on year. So data was not being recorded. Data specifically on anti-Muslim hatred was not being recorded prior to 2016. So in 2016, the government told police that they need to disaggregate hate crime data so that they didn't just record, if a Muslim person came to them and said, I've been attacked or I've suffered a hate crime because of my faith or the way I look, they didn't just record it as a racially aggravated hate crime. They actually disaggregated it as an anti-Muslim hate crime. And that wasn't being done before. The only hate crime that was being disaggregated was anti-Semitism. But after myself and others pushed for anti-Muslim hate crime to be disaggregated, then the government steered the police to do that, not only for anti-Muslim hate crime, but also for other forms of hate crime. So actually that had a benefit not just for Muslims, but for other minorities as well, which is really important. But anyway, if you look at the data, you'll see year on year there's an increase in the number of hate crimes suffered by Muslims in this country. And last year in particular, there was a 19% increase against Muslims. But this only tells part of the story. What you actually find is that most hate crime is not reported. So there are so many sort of different studies, and we actually need to do more research in this. But if you look at the surveys that are taken, so there is an annual survey which is called it used to be called the British Crime Survey, it might be called something slightly different now, where basically the police and the government go and ask people, have you suffered a hate crime? They ask them a whole range of questions, but have you suffered a hate crime? What type of hate crime? Did you report it? It's estimated that the real figures of people suffering hate crime is 2 to 3 times more than the actual reports. So that shows a significant underreporting. And there's lots of reasons why people don't report, and I'm sure some of you can guess them. But just as a kind of, I just want to kind of do a little bit of an experiment, and you can take part in it if you want to. But if you've suffered a hate crime, or what you think is a hate crime, could you put your hand up? Thank you. And how many of you reported it? So most of the hands went down. And do you mind saying, did you report it to the police or another organisation?
So I only reported a few and not all of them.
Yeah.
And
To the police. Okay, well done. That's really good. But were you, if you don't mind me asking, were you sort of satisfied with what happened? No. Okay. Yeah. So that's really familiar. So most people who suffer a hate crime So actually, most people who suffer a hate crime are women, which is kind of what we saw. And then in our little experiment, and then most people who suffer a hate crime will suffer it more than once. So I've experienced stuff, as I'm sure so many Muslim women experience this stuff. You know, abuse when you're going to the mosque. Sometimes it's verbal abuse when you're just on the tube. Sometimes it can be a microaggression. Sometimes it can be a lot worse. Somebody spitting, somebody yanking your hijab. But often, you know, I'll say I'm a repeat victim because I've experienced it that many times. And I've not reported it every single time, even though I know I should. And I'm not even going to talk about the online stuff that I experience on a regular basis, which also I've tried to report but hasn't gone anywhere. But then most people don't report. And then when they do report, many don't feel happy with the outcome that or the response they've received from the police. And that's why it's really important to have a space, an organisation like British Muslim Trust, where people can go and report and they can feel like they'll be speaking to somebody who understands what they've experienced. They won't doubt them. They're more than likely have experienced it as well, and they can give that support, they can create a safe space, and they can also be that advocate as well. There are other studies, surveys and things which look at, our University of Sussex a few years ago did a survey asking Muslims if they'd suffered a hate crime. From their respondents, I can't remember how many people they surveyed, I think it was a couple of thousand, something like 80% had said they hadn't reported it, basically. So if you just think about the number of Muslims in the country, or even the number of Muslims in London, and then how many are actually reporting and how many are actually suffering a hate crime, there's a huge gap. And why is this important? So another thing we've heard when we're going out and about is that a lot of people are feeling like, actually, you know what, I'm kind of fed up. We've heard this before. We've had other organizations come to us and say, you know, you need to report hate crime, especially anti-Muslim hate crime or Islamophobic hate crime. You know, it's gonna change things. But it's so important because when I speak to police, I spoke to somebody from the police in the Met Police yesterday. If I speak to people in the council, they'll tell me that without the data, we can't invest resources to keep people safe. So, for example, the police said that their data, albeit however limited it is, tells them that hate crime is more likely to happen in town centres. So then they'll invest more police presence, you know, in town centres to try and stop hate crime or around specific events. Simple stuff like that can't happen if there isn't the data there. Similarly, in Manchester, you know, somebody from the council said to me that when they look at other policy areas, there's really clear and robust data so that when they're deciding the budgets every year, they can put money towards those different policy areas. But with hate crime, and especially Islamophobic hate crime, there just isn't that data. So they can't put those resources towards dealing with it. And that means that then we're in this cycle. They don't put the resources to deal with it. They don't train the police. They don't train the staff. It's not a priority for councils. But then it's happening. But then people don't feel safe to try and report it to them. Or if they report it, they don't get the right kind of response. And so then they don't report it again. And then we have a lack of data. So there is this kind of cycle there that needs to be addressed. And that's what we're trying to do with the British Muslim Trust, is create a space where we can be that place to not only get the data, but get the support, give people the tools to understand what is a hate crime and how to report it and how to overcome it as well. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about the increase in hate crime. So Home Office recently put out figures on hate crime, specifically on anti-Muslim hate crime. There's been a 19% increase from last year. The previous year, I think it was 13% increase. So that was a total 4,478 recorded hate crimes. That is just the number that was recorded. That's just the number of reports that went to the police. That doesn't include like the convictions and anything like that. So you can see there's 4 million Muslims in the UK and only 4,000 reports, and we're still seeing such a huge increase. And if 80% of Muslims are saying in the UK that they've experienced hate crime, then these numbers aren't matching up, so there's still a long way to go. 45% of religiously motivated hate crimes, so that's looking at the whole category of hate crimes against people based on their religion, Sikh, Hindu, Jewish, 45% of those were targeted against Muslims. And we also saw that there was a notable spike, which is probably not a surprise to many of you, after the Southport attacks in 2024 and then the riots that took place across the country. So at British Muslim Trust, we, as I mentioned, we were set up in July, and over the summer there were these campaigns. You probably have all heard of them. There was the sort of the nationalist campaign where people were raising the flags across the country, England flags, the Union Jack. There was also quite a few protests, and they're still ongoing outside hotels that house asylum seekers. So that was like another, I don't want to call it a campaign, but another kind of resurgence of anti-immigrant sort of sentiment that was expressed through protests, but some of those became violent as well, and they were quite intimidatory. And we were hearing that there was a knock-on effect of those kind of protests and those campaigns on mosques around the country, but there wasn't really any kind of like understanding of why this was happening. People were saying, you know, I think my mosque has been attacked, or there's an increase in attacks against mosques, but actually what was happening behind that? What was happening behind that feeling? So we did a snapshot briefing look at the number of attacks from July to October, and we used reports that came to us. We used publicly available data, and we were quite stringent in how we classified an attack against a mosque. So and this happened in Liverpool, outside the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, there were two individual girls who were chased and threatened with a knife. That is horrific, and that's horrible. And it was reported to the police, and the girls I think they had just left the mosque, and there were two young girls. We hadn't actually included that in our data because we were trying to be really specific and really robust about our data, because we were looking at specifically attacks against mosques. So the headlines are that across the country, we saw 27 attacks in this 3-month period against mosques. And a couple of those mosques had repeat attacks. So there were actually 27 attacks, 25 mosques in 23 different towns and cities across the UK. Now, if you look at those individual attacks, some of them took place not too far from here in Watford, were placement of like a flag, or some of them were graffiti of a cross on the mosque. If you look at that as an individual thing, some mosques wouldn't even report that to the police, because they'll be like, it's neighbours messing around, it's teenagers messing around, or we don't want to trouble the police, or whatever reason, some mosques won't even report that. But if you look at it individually, you could be like, that's a small incident, maybe. But if you take a step back and you look at a 3-month period of concerted attacks against mosques, ranging from what you could term low-level Christian symbolism, national symbolism, placement of flags, all the way to something much more severe and violent. A plastic bullet was shot through the window of a mosque in Liverpool, all the way to the arson attack on the mosque in Peacehaven. Then we're seeing an upsurge in attacks against mosques in ways which is unprecedented, that in my experience we've not seen before. We have seen spates of attacks against mosques. It's not like it's never happened before. It has, unfortunately. There was a terrorist attack in 2017 against a mosque in Finsbury Park. Earlier this year in January, there was a spate of attacks against 6 mosques that was instigated on Telegram via Russia. Accounts in Russia were telling people on Telegram, if you go and attack a mosque in the UK, we'll pay you. That happened. But this is not that. This is something completely separate. And it's correlated. What we found when we looked at those attacks against mosques in the UK, that 40% of them contained nationalistic symbols, the flags, and Christian symbols and slogans. And the Christian symbols and slogans is something we've never seen before. We've seen F Islam or F whatever, or pork or whatever, placed in the mosque, but we've not seen somebody putting a cross in the mosque before, or Jesus is king. And that also correlates with the Unite the Rally Kingdom that took place in September this year, which was organised, have I called it the right thing? Unite the Kingdom Rally, which was organised by Tommy Robinson, where he brought Christian preachers from abroad who burnt a flag that said La ilaha illallah on it, and they burnt the Palestinian flag. So these things that we are seeing in terms of attacks against mosques aren't isolated in that sense. They're not random. They're correlating with these other, for want of a better term, campaigns that we're seeing, this resurgence of extreme nationalism in some cases. The Union Jack and the England flag are British symbols. They're our flag, right? There's nothing wrong with them, but they are being weaponized. They are being utilized to enact victimization against symbols of Islam, against Muslims, and that's not right, and that's unacceptable. I'll just move forward a little bit. So we are here to help and support, basically, and not only to track and monitor, but to help and support and to make sure that all of these instances are not only recorded, but we understand how they're happening, why they're happening, and where they're happening, and we give that analysis to government and to the police. So if I just go back actually to the briefing about the mosque attacks, we made key recommendations in that report as well. And those recommendations are hopefully, they're being examined by government, and hopefully they'll be taken forward. Some of those recommendations include the fact that local authorities and councils, they need to understand, and this is being done in some places, but not every place, they need to understand that mosques are vulnerable, so that if a mosque is reporting to them that they are suffering hostility, that is accounted for, that they support the mosque. The government has its own security fund for mosques that mosques can apply to, but local councils and local infrastructure should also be looking at mosques in the same way they look at synagogues as vulnerable and to support them. But they also need to understand that mosques are not like synagogues. Mosques want to keep their doors open. They want to invite people in on the weekend or during the week for, to feed them, to have a soup kitchen or whatever it is, a homelessness drive or whatever it is. Mosques want to be able to keep their spaces open. Some mosques work in inner city areas. They work with people young people, ex-offenders who would be put off by seeing, guards and police and whatever, and they want to be able to invite those people in to help them reintegrate into the community, to support them, to stop them from reoffending. So we're putting recommendations, nuanced recommendations to government that mosques need to be given that support, but in a way that helps them play that vital role that they're playing in communities already. So at British Muslim Trust, as I mentioned, we have a helpline service. Our helpline is multi-channel, which means if you go on our website right now, you would be able to report a hate crime that if you suffered it. It could be something you suffered recently, it could be something you suffered last week or 2 months ago. We have a form there. You can also contact us via WhatsApp. We recently had a case of a woman who basically had young children when she suffered a hate crime. She found it much easier to be able to contact us through WhatsApp because she didn't want her children to be reliving and rehearing this traumatic experience by her talking on the phone about it to us. So she used WhatsApp. And the WhatsApp number is the same as the telephone number, which is 0808 172 3524. You can call us Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you call us outside of those hours, then you can leave a message and we'll call you back within 48 hours. We also have a web chat option, and we also have email. People can also contact us via email as well. And we're trying to make it as easy as possible, as simple as possible for people to report to us. So we're also working on building the ability for people to report to us through Instagram DMs and Facebook Messenger as well. And this is the form. If you go to our website, you can see the form there. And the form is basically in 3 stages. So first you will talk about yourself, you give us details. And just to say that all the reports to our helpline are confidential. You can also report to us anonymously as well. And whilst we do encourage people to report to the police, if they don't want to, then they don't have to. Or they can ask us to report on their behalf, but not share their details, so we can report to the police anonymously on people's behalf as well. And we can be that role, as I mentioned. We can be the person behind the scenes that's helping and guiding somebody if they report to the police, which is what we did with a young 16-year-old girl in Sheffield recently. Or we can be that advocate. We can be that interface between the victim and the police, and that's what we're trying to do right now with a young boy in Manchester, in Birmingham, that I mentioned earlier. So there's different ways that you can get involved with supporting British Muslim Trust. The first thing is, obviously, if you suffer anything, if you've experienced anything, report it. If you've suffered a crime that happened more than 6 months ago or a year ago, there might be a time limit with whether or not the police can investigate it. But if you've never reported it, I would still encourage you to report to us, because in that and tell us the date, the rough date when you experience it, because that means we'll have that data and we'll be able to share that data at the end of the year when we and inform government, police and society that this is what Muslims are experiencing, or people who are perceived to be Muslim, and these are the things that we need to do to try and address it. So reporting is the first thing. The other thing is, we are really keen to talk to people who've used our service or people who thought about using it but don't want to use it. We really want to hear that feedback so that we can try and build a better service as well. And we're constantly doing that kind of monitoring and evaluation to see where we can improve things. Working in partnership with other organizations, Muslim organizations, mosques, non-Muslim organizations, councils, police are really, really critical, because I think what's not really understood, and now there is this debate about whether or not Islamophobia is a thing, but what's really not understood is that actually anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia is not just bad for Muslims, but it's bad for society. It's not good for society. It undermines cohesion, undermines the ability of people to live their full lives, to contribute to society, but it's also being used and weaponized to undermine democracy by people like the owner of X and other social media platforms, if I could put it in that way, basically. And that is an issue not just for Muslims, but it's an issue for anybody who is interested in progressive, liberal values and wants to see Britain be a strong, inclusive society. So partnering and building allies is really, really important. Volunteering, we're new, but we're always looking for people to help us and volunteer in any shape or form, whether that's giving out leaflets or talking to people about us or being like a kind of community sort of ambassador. Please reach out to us, contact us. We'd really love to hear from you. And in campaigning, haven't spoken too much about this, but we are trying to do some research and looking at attitudes and how we can try and shift attitudes as well. That's in the pipeline, because we don't want, after the riots last year, we saw a lot of good people just come out on the streets and say not in our name, and hold counter protests to those riots. And we see that outside the asylum seeker hotels as well. And that's great. And we want to invest in that. We want to build those allies and really try and shape people's attitudes. So we are also investing in and planning campaigns to raise awareness of the negative impact of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, not only on Muslims, but on this country as well. And also more broadly, because obviously we live in a global world. So those are the kind of different ways that you can get involved with British Muslim Trust. And here is just one example of Shiza Majid, who is a young Pakistani heritage woman who basically saw the kind of flag campaigns that were going on over the summer and saw how they were being directed at, Muslims, Pakistani, Indian, black Muslims, all different types of heritages. And so she just put together this exhibition to just really show kind of like her father and just show who he is and his sort of identity and the kind of rich diversity of his identity as well. And these kind of campaigns, this went viral. These kind of campaigns are just really, really important to just humanize and, for want of a better word, normalize, the fact that British Muslims are like any other person in this country, basically, and we should enjoy the same rights, the same safety. We should be able to go about our lives without feeling fearful or anxious or being worried about being attacked or experiencing any kind of prejudice or discrimination. And yeah, those are our website and our phone number. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Akeela. We have some time for questions if there are any.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your talk. So what's the difference between you and this Tell Mama? Because they do this sort of similar idea, don't they? Reporting the crimes and you've heard about them, because I just went online. And when you say report to the police, do you mean go online and report it? That's presumably the easiest way, isn't it? Is that correct? Because you don't expect them to actually do anything. You just want to have numbers, in effect.
So I can talk about British Muslim Trust. Obviously, there are other organisations that are working in this space, a kind of reporting, monitoring space. There's Telmama, there's other ones as well. At British Muslim Trust, we are putting Muslim communities at the heart of our services. We are from the Muslim communities. Our founder organisations are from Muslim communities. We have, you know, the networks amongst Muslim communities and the if you like, we have the contact on the ground with mosques, and we're working with different types of communities on the ground. We're still building that. We're still building our credibility. We're still building our trust with communities and trying to raise awareness. In terms of reporting to the police, so there's different ways to report to the police. The main one is you can do it online. It's probably the quickest and the efficient way to do it as a third-party reporting organisation. And we can do that through True Vision. We can do that through, if a police force has their own portal. A lot of the police forces have their own portal. So the Met Police, for example, they prefer it if we use their online portal. But we also have contacts with different police forces and their hate crime leads as well. So if there is something, for example, we had a case recently in London where somebody basically said, you know, contacted the police, got X response, wasn't happy with it. Please could you talk to us? Please could you help me with that? So then we went to the hate crime lead there and said, look, this is the situation, you know, what do you know about this? Similarly, we've done that in Birmingham as well. So we have both approaches. I can't talk for the police. You know, they have their own issues, and if you speak to the Met right now, they will admit that public confidence and trust in them is at an all-time low. I'm sure many of you saw the Panorama documentary, which was awful. It highlighted police misconduct. It also highlighted that, you know, there are members of the police who hold anti-Muslim views themselves, basically, as well as misogynistic and other views, racist views. And I've said openly to the police, I was recently at the National Association for Muslim Police conference, and they had done their own survey asking Muslim police officers about their experiences of Islamophobia within the police force. And as you can imagine, you know, nearly 50% of them said they'd experienced Islamophobia in the police force themselves. And, you know, they also asked non-Muslim police officers about their views about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. And while some of them recognised it, some of them said they would report it, they have reported it, there were some who basically said they didn't understand Islamophobia. They said, what is Islamophobia? We should be able to criticise Islam. So they conflated legitimate criticism and debate of a religion with enacting hate against somebody and prejudice just because of their background. So obviously the police have huge issues themselves, and we're seeing consistently, actually, in some cases, that the police responses are lacking, and we're feeding that back. So, for example, that was one of the things we put in the report about the attacks against mosques, because consistently mosques told us that the police did not respond appropriately, or they just didn't even bother turning up.
Hello. Salams. Thank you for your talk. It was a very good knowledge. Now, I know you said the police are very biased. I've experienced this as well. I've also talked. And the police have said, well, if he's telling to us that Islam is a peaceful religion, come and teach us. Come to our offices and teach us where it's peaceful. And we don't see that it's peaceful. The police people have actually said that to me. And they've actually said that even if there are hate crimes, you know, they're not going to take it forward. They're not going to take it to court. They're not going to take it to prison or anything. I know I've heard a lot of the cases that young children get beaten up. The teachers know they don't do anything. They say, oh, it's their fault. You know, they don't want to step in at all. And when you ask the teachers why, oh, this is how kids act, you know. So it's about time that the police or the people like yourself or many others talk to the police and say that, look, Islam is a peaceful religion, because they're saying it amongst themselves, and I was able to hear this conversation coming from them, that it's not a peaceful religion. Why should we back you up? What right have we got? We're going against our own ethics. So it's, you know, it would be good if you could step into the police and tell them where it's peace, because you see a lot of these Muslim lunatics, you know, they want jihad and they want this. They don't understand what jihad means. They just think it's fight. When I turned around and told them and said, look, it's a struggle, well, they said, well, no one tells us. If none of you Muslim people come and tell us, it's not our fault. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I don't think all the cases that you said they've been reported. How many of those people have gone to prison? How many have got, you know, criminal records? I don't think many, because that's what they've told me. How many would you say have got criminal records? Like you said, that 12-year-old kid got attacked in Birmingham. Did that guy go to prison? Did he get a criminal record?
Yeah, I mean, that case is still live, actually. And
so, but how many have actually gone to court, and how many have gone to prison? Because, you know, it seems to get more and more fiercer. You know, they're ganging up on these 18 to 20-year-old kids to stand by the school and attack the Muslim people, and especially going on a Friday prayers. You know, I've heard this with other people, I don't know, and I thought, God, this is horrific. But, you know, obviously we have not put guards out. You know what I mean? We are also to blame. If we know its attacks are increasing, we have to do something, get our men, trained to give us a self-defense. You go to the Sikh community, I've got a lot of people, friends of mine, Sikh in Southall. The white person never goes there because he knows that he'll get daggers, he'll get cricket bats on his back, on his head, you know? So you have to train our people to say, look, there are many young, strong men within our Khoja community, and they have to be trained to defend us. Because the police said they will not do all the things because there are so many cuts, and should we just focus on Islam and Islamophobia and Islamic people? If you feel so strongly, you do about it. Sorry, I'm just saying this.
No, I mean, I think, you know, obviously, I think it's good that we should invest in fitness and health, but not with a view just to, you know, kind of be vigilantes. And, you know, and also as Muslims, I think I can only speak for myself, but I know that we like to be open, right? And we like to invite people in to understand who we are, understand our faith, understand the services that we give, not only to our own communities, but to our communities around us. I think that's, you know, the ethos of this centre here. So, you know, not everybody wants a guard actually outside, and maybe we shouldn't need to have a guard either. We don't want to have these big gates and bulky looking guys and look scary and whatever. We want to be able to be safe to go about who we are, to invite people in. Maybe we need a few more police patrols or whatever, something like that. Work with the local communities. I think that's a much better approach actually. That way then we can retain who we are and our, you know, what our faith tells us how to be, rather than kind of being scared and kind of being closed off and, you know, being like, no, we don't want to know you kind of thing.
Thank you, Sal.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your talk. I was just curious about, in terms of how you're defining hate crime when you're kind of recording this data. I know you mentioned briefly about being quite, with the mosque report being quite stringent in terms of you want to make sure that the data you're collecting is robust. But I'm curious in terms of, I guess, the ways in which Islamophobia manifests that aren't being shouted at in the streets or physically or verbally abused and are kind of more subtle. So like microaggressions, for example, things that are quite difficult for people to even explain or put into words when they're trying to fill out a reporting form. So kind of, and also to even explain to the police or another institution or, you know, people who don't understand what it's like to be a minority. And the other bit is like the institutional side of Islamophobia. So how it structurally manifests through the state itself. And like what scope is there in terms of, for example, you know, Islamophobia permeates through so many different actions that the government's taking right now. For example, the way that the police are dealing with and the way the government has prescribed Palestine action and the arrest that, you know, like the criminalization and the way in which Palestinian solidarity has been decried as terroristic is reminiscent of like it's all fueled by Islamophobia, right, and anti-Muslim hatred. So I'm just wondering in terms of how all of this wider, both the microaggressions and then this kind of wider institutional lens, prevent referrals, for example, that disproportionately impact Muslims, kind of how that feeds into your reporting, essentially.
Yeah, so I think if I start with hate crime, because that's our sort of remit, we look at hate crime and hate incidents. And so I think there's an educational piece that we're trying to do as well, which is to try and educate people about what is a hate crime. So essentially a hate crime is any crime perpetrated that is done so with a view against somebody because of their faith. So for example, if somebody burgled your house, that will be a burglary. But if somebody burgled your house because you're Muslim, then that would be a racially and religiously motivated hate crime, and aggravated hate crime, as well as being a burglary. So it's a burglary that is religiously aggravated because it's also being classed as a hate crime, which means that it would be, if it went to court and then the offender was convicted, that it would carry a much stronger sentence. So essentially, the way hate crime law operates in this country is that it's layered on top of existing crimes. So that it could be a public. So I don't know if you guys are aware of somebody who went into a mosque in Peterborough and was like shouting abuse and talking about Tommy Robinson and stuff like that. That man was charged with public disorder because it was deemed a public disorder offence, but it was religiously and racially aggravated. That's in the law, that's how it's phrased. And so that was more severe. And the reason that hate crimes carry more severe sentences and are viewed more seriously is because of the impact that it has, not only on the victim, but also then the wider community as well. It often has this kind of community impact. So, for example, if a woman suffers, like somebody yanked her hijab off, I don't know exactly what that would be in hate crime law. I think it's assault, but it would be religiously aggravated assault. But we also know that that woman then would, the story of her having her hijab pulled off would have a ripple effect on her family, on her community. Probably lots of women around her then would be like, okay, I'm not going to go to that place, that mall where your hijab was pulled off, or that train station, or I won't go that dark, or I won't go there alone. And this is what's happening. So many Muslim women are adjusting their lives as a result of the fear of hate crime. So we work within existing legislation and hate crime law and guidance. Essentially, a hate crime is defined by the perception of the victim. So if somebody burgles your house and you think it's because you're Muslim, you have to tell the police that I've suffered this crime and it's an anti-Muslim hate crime. That's really important. People aren't doing that. They'll call the police and be like, I suffered this, or somebody is verbally abusive to me, and then it won't get recorded as a religiously motivated hate crime or anti-Muslim hate crime, because the police are not properly equipped and they don't understand, but also like what is an anti-Muslim hate crime, but also because if they're not hearing it from the victim, then they won't record it properly. And that's why at British Muslim Trust we're there to try and be that advocate and make sure that it's also recorded by the police properly as well. So that's the kind of first thing. Obviously there is work being done there was by the government to look at a definition of anti-Muslim hatred / Islamophobia. That work is concentrating on a definition that wouldn't be legally binding. It would be non-statutory, but it could be, if government decides to adopt it, it could be used by police, CPS, schools, universities, businesses to understand what is anti-Muslim hatred beyond a hate crime, beyond what's in the legislation already, and to try and to enable organisations to have more robust policies and to deal with it better. And then that would cover things like discrimination in the workplace. So there's lots of studies which show, that have been done where CVs have been sent, identical CVs, have a Western name, the person gets the interview, have a Muslim name, they don't get an interview, basically. And then there's more studies which show that, you know, when people go to interviews, they can receive hostile questions. I know people who they went to an interview and they'll ask for their views on the Middle East, for example, or do you intend to wear that thing while you're at work, meaning the hijab or whatever, basically. So there's lots of different, you know, ways that employers are actually discriminating against, which is unlawful discrimination. And actually, if somebody went and complained to the EHRC, and the EHRC did their job, they could actually sue those potential employers. But you know, that's not happening. And there's lots of structures actually in place that could be utilised to try and address discrimination and prejudice against Muslims where it's happening beyond hate crime, but that's not happening either. So in terms of British Muslim Trust, we're also there to try and educate employers, and we've not started that program of work yet, but try and do that kind of training and advocacy and kind of strategic influence to help organizations understand where they could do better in terms of, you know, mitigating against, you know, prejudice against Muslims in the workplace. We recently actually did some work with a large media company. They have a training module for people across their organization on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, and we did some work with them to basically improve that training module. So there's lots of scope basically to do work, and then obviously there is the kind of the wider stuff that you're talking about. That's something that, you know, there are other organizations that are looking at that and that are working in that space, and they're doing, you know, they're making different progress in that, and they're kind of being the advocates talking about that. That's not something that we're immediately going into, but we will be led by the evidence. We will be led by the reports that we get to, that come through to us on the helpline. So where we do research, where we gather evidence and data, if we're seeing that there is discrimination, hostility, negativity as a result of whatever government policy, then we will talk about that. We won't shy away from that.
Thank you. Just one or two more questions, if that's okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for this really important topic. So when you were saying about the symbolism being increased in the recently with Christian and British flags as well, it kind of made me think. Recently, there's been an increase in poppies being really large poppies being stapled to lampposts all over the place, on trees and everything. And I'm wondering if it's just something generally in the air that's encouraging people to use such bold symbolism, and also like on lampposts having the Union Jack as well, but it seems like that's something that's approved by the council, these things. So it kind of seems to go hand in hand with the rise in the far-right protest symbolism recently, and this kind of council-approved symbolism as well.
So I think, like, you know, symbols like the Union Jack, the England flag, the poppy, they're part of British identity and they're part of British heritage. And in of themselves, there is obviously nothing wrong with them. They're part of the national identity. But I think, you know, there needs to be education about how Muslims who are British, or even those who are not British, are part of that story of national identity and national heritage. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but there were a significant, I think it's about a million plus number of Muslims from the subcontinent countries, from, you know, primarily from India, that took part voluntarily in World War I and World War II. There are thousands of unmarked graves of veterans who basically were Muslims who took part in the world wars, sacrificed their lives, that didn't receive the recognition that they deserved, like the other soldiers got the recognition, and they have their unmarked graves. So these symbols, whether we identify them with not on an individual basis, and whether or not we might feel allegiance to them or not on an individual basis, is a separate conversation. But these symbols are part of our national identity. And actually, if you look at studies most Muslims, probably something like 80% of Muslims, feel strongly British, proud to be British, and part of that narrative. Maybe that might change in recent years, but so when we talk about things like the Union Jack, the English flag, the poppy, those are our symbols, whether people like it or not. But what's happening right now is that those symbols are being used by extreme nationalists to weaponize them and to separate and otherize Muslims from the rest of the country, from the rest of the national narrative, positive narrative and identity. And that is what's wrong. You know, so there was a girl in Bradford recently, a Syrian girl, a refugee who settled in Bradford with her family, who experienced so basically in Bradford she lived in a white area, and in her neighborhood, on her street, she predominantly had white neighbors, and there was her family, and then there was another Arab family on this road. She settled here, she's integrated, she came here because Syrians were invited to come here because of what was happening in Syria. And she's at university and, you know, trying to live her life like any other normal young woman would do. And one day, not too long ago, outside her house, there was a man wearing an English cross, you know, big flag, he was wearing it, walked up and down the road between her house and the Iraqi family's house. Up and down, up and down. He was intimidating them. They didn't understand why he was there. And why was he only going between her house and the Iraqi family's house? And they'd never seen him before, so how did he know that her house was a Syrian family house and the other house was the Iraqi family house? They didn't know why or how or what, basically, but they were scared. But he was doing this for 5 hours, and it was their white neighbors who came to them and said, we've seen this guy going up and down between your house and the other people's house. Do you know who he is? And they were like, no, we don't know who he is. We're scared, basically. And they were like, okay, look, we're going to go and sort this out. We're going to talk to him. So they went, they spoke to him, they negotiated with him, and eventually they got rid of him. At no point did anybody think that they could call the police, because that was a crime, that was a hate crime. At no point did they think they could do that. But also, why was he wearing an English flag and using that to intimidate them? These are symbols which should not be used to intimidate and otherize and ostracize, you know, minorities and people of color and Muslims. But that's what's happening at the moment. And it's not the flag that's the problem. It's the people who are using it in that way that are the problem.
I think we'll take one final question.
With the government shifting further right, hello? Okay. With the government shifting further right and reform gaining more traction, how will your organisation realistically protect Muslims when state policy itself may become less willing to recognise or act on Islamophobia?
This is obviously a challenge, what we're seeing across politics in this country, that people are becoming more emboldened. And we're hearing that, we're seeing that in the hate crime figures, we're hearing it when we talk to people. People are telling us that they've got neighbours who are voting for reform and they're scared because of what people associate reform with. But there are also complexities and nuances as well. There are people who are Muslim who are voting reform as well. And I think we have to just kind of take a step back a little bit and try and understand, why are people being attracted to reform? Or why are people being attracted to any kind of what would have been seen as fringe 10, 15 years ago and now seen as more mainstream? Anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant narratives are often conflated and they are becoming much more mainstream. We've seen that. And that does pose a challenge, not just for an organisation like British Muslim Trust, but for society, basically. It's a society. It's on all of us to try and address some of those narratives and to try and push to protect that kind of middle ground space. And especially as Muslims, you know, we are sort of, you know, from the middle ground, in the middle ground, and it's really important that we don't retreat into our own spaces. We don't retreat into those kind of fringe spaces either, that we partake in society where we can, we contribute, we have our voices, and we make sure those voices are heard. At British Muslim Trust, you know, our job is to support victims and be that voice for victims and to monitor hate crime where we see it, but we're also doing research as well, looking at, like the research that we did on the mosque briefing, looking at beneath the surface, drawing out the analysis of what are the correlations that we are seeing, what is the impact of these different campaigns on people. It's perfectly legitimate to have a conversation about our national identity and whether or not, what does it mean to be English, what does it mean to be British. It's perfectly legitimate to have a conversation about immigration at our borders, but that does not mean that we can enact crime against people, that we should ostracize them, that we should be prejudiced against them, we should discriminate against them either. And I think that's the space we're trying to work in, to advocate and to ensure that, people's rights are protected, essentially, in that sense.
Thank you very much. Muhammad wa ala Muhammad salawat. I think Akeela will be around for a little bit longer if people want to approach and ask some questions later. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've also brought some leaflets and stuff here as well, if anybody wants to take them away, to kind of put them up in places or just share them with people.
Thank you. Brothers and sisters, next week we have Ayaz and Sarah Ali, who will be speaking to us about finding spirituality through creativity. So Ayaz Ali is a photographer, and Sarah Ali is a writer, and she's written some books on Ashura and Arba'in and the Lamentations, which they'll have their books available here as well. The following Wednesday we'll be having Dr. Kauthar Abbas will be speaking to us on the birth anniversary of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. The following week we'll have Imran Mullah, who will be speaking to us on his book, The Indian Caliphate, Exiled Ottomans and the Billionaire Prince. And then the following week we'll have Arfa Farouk, who will be speaking to us about Islamic makers and how she developed that organization. We'll continue with the rest of our regular programs through the week, including the exercise classes on Mondays and Tuesdays, and our Dua Kamal program on Thursdays, and on Fridays we have our regular Salam talks, and then Saturdays we have our tuition classes and women walking, and we have Tafsir class and Husseini Madrasa on Sundays. If you'd like to join us for any of those, please visit the website for more details. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.